and welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick with the City of Hampton. And today we are going to introduce you to an expansion in the permanent collection of the Hampton History Museum. My guest is Alan Hoilman. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
You guys are expanding your telling of the story of NACA and NASA in Hampton and what that meant to the world and
exactly,
to the city.
yes.
That's really exciting. One of the things people tell me is that Hampton doesn't really talk loudly enough about NASA and what's there and how we were much of the birth of the space movement.
Exactly. We think of NASA now as this big institution that's nationwide and is all over the country in these huge research labs everywhere, including Langley.
Yeah.
But it started here. The research lab was here, and for several decades it was the only really vibrant aeronautical research lab in the country. So it is the home of the NACA and NASA.
And we sometimes forget that because, I mean, Huntsville popped up and President Johnson moved a lot of stuff to Houston, and of course Cape Canaveral, and it is a little bit of a nationwide, everywhere thing. It started here.
It did.
We need to make a bigger deal of that,
yes,
and you guys are about to do it.
We're going to try very hard.
Well, tell us a little bit about why it was located here in the first place. Like, what is the genesis of this?
Well, it's actually an interesting story with an interesting aside. The War Department was looking for a flying field. To experiment with aircraft and to train their pilots. We had fallen woefully behind the rest of the world by the middle of World War I because they were fighting a war. And they had no limitations to expenses and technology and commitment to the effort. We had limitations. We didn't have a budget that reflected an emphasis on this work. And the Wright brothers themselves were an interesting characters in playing this out because they sued everyone. Everyone who put a wing on something, they sued because they considered the innovation proprietary information
of theirs. All of the whole airplane concept.
So we had fallen drastically behind. The War Department wanted to catch up because they saw the clouds gathering.
Yeah.
And in Washington, concerned scientists began to believe that there was also a need for a kind of civilian development that could look at this problem, and the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics was founded. And it was literally just a committee with a budget of only $5,000. They met in Washington, D.C. They founded them in 1915, and they very quickly came to the realization that we were, in fact, not just militarily ill-prepared, but we were technologically far behind the rest of the world, and we had some catching up to do. So they wanted to piggyback this need for a flying field with a need for a developmental laboratory. So they began to work together with the War Department and started looking around the country for sites that might be relevant. They might have all the features they needed. It needed to be near water so they could do all kinds of experimentation both over land and water. It needed to be near Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. It needed to be far enough away from Washington, D.C. It needed to be at a railroad spur, so because everything still moved by railroad. And of course, we had the benefit of having the waterways, so that stuff could also move here by waterway. So after looking at locations in Maryland and Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee, Hampton was chosen. And there was some, backroom bargaining done to lure them here. But there were some local gentlemen who were fascinated with the idea of bringing that here for a couple of reasons. They were businessmen. They were finely attuned to the needs of the economy here. And the seafood industry had begun to decline, which was our moneymaker. Mm-hmm. Our other moneymaker, and this is where it gets a little bit of an aside, our other moneymaker was liquor distribution and sales. And in 1914, Virginia voted for prohibition 5 years before the rest of the country. And it was determined that it would take effect on November 1st, 1916. So that was the urgency of it.
There's a fiscal cliff there. We were hurting.
Yep, these city fathers understood the need, and they said, we've got to have something to take the place of this economic engine by the end of 1916, and by gums they did. They found some plantations just north of town on the back river that were not being well utilized, and they bought up the options on the land managed to persuade the War Department that this is the place to put it. And the War Department purchased the land, and that's how Langley was born.
So Langley Field came first, just very little bit ahead of NACA then.
Well, they actually were
simultaneous.
The NACA was always considered part of the field from the very, even when they began their search.
Both at
they
the
were
same
co-locating,
time then.
absolutely.
Okay.
So that's how they came to be here. We had some founding fathers who had the foresight to think about the economy and the clout to do make some connections and understand the right politicians, and here it came.
So the Air Force and the budding scientists who would be NASA came all at the same time and really began to do that national research and testing and study and development, but also began changing the character of Hampton. This is
absolutely.
We became high tech at that point.
Yes, Hampton was a fishing town. Hampton was a town based on the seafood industry. Now we had Fort Monroe, which was a military presence, but before then it was seafood and liquor sales. And
you need to do an exhibit on that next.
I'm working on that. I am working on how that can affect the economy. But so yeah, Hampton then shifted, and I like to think of it this way. This is 1917, the groundbreaking. The War Department, interestingly enough, moved their flying field inland to Ohio, but left the spotting service, Langley Field, to train on. So it still was central to the Army Air Corps developing their technologies. But once the field itself was completed, then the NACA began to build first small buildings and laboratories, and then larger buildings with wind tunnels in them, and then huge wind tunnels that, think of a public works project like unto building Hampton Coliseum, except one every 3 years.
Wow.
So local contractors and local labor became involved, and it really, during the boom of the 20s, Hampton flourished because there was all of this money flowing into the economy. And when the Depression came, Hampton was somewhat insulated from it, because even with the economic decline, Hampton had engineers and scientists, and they were still building. They had federal money, so they were still building wind tunnels right through the Depression. Roosevelt understood that even though we were in the midst of a depression, World War II was coming. He understood that from the beginning. So the resources kept ramping up for Langley Field. So, and it changed a fishing village into Silicon Valley over the course of about 10 years.
Right.
So you went to the hardware store, and instead of just running into your friends that you've known for 30 years who were fishermen and businessmen, you started running into engineers and scientists and military officers. So it did really change the character of the city.
So, and that was, of course, just the airplane.
That was just the airplane.
Part of the mission. And then you go through World War II, and that's when you get the sort of labor shortage because the men were off fighting, and the pool of mathematicians and scientists became inclusive of women.
That's
and then
correct.
The hidden figures, the African American women, which was another huge leap, and African American men, because while they might have been a little more welcomed, it was still not typical kind of job.
It was a difficult time
Yeah.
to be included in this work if you were a woman or African American. But one of the fun things that the NACA was able to offer was a kind of a broad federal look at hiring practices rather than just the local Virginia segregative laws. So they were able to sidestep that, and they hired African-American women, they hired African-American men in professional tasks, not just as technicians and caretakers. So it really did begin to, beginning in the 40s, it began to be the first site in Virginia that was integrated, kind of organically integrated. So you had the wonderful story of how in the 30s, white women came to have employment at Langley as mathematicians, because the engineers, putting an engineer's mind to the work, said, we need help, and we don't care who they are. If they're good mathematicians, we need their help. So they hired women who were this source of talent In the 40s, they included African American women into that lot, and they succeeded beyond, I believe, anyone's wildest expectations.
And so how that changes Hampton is we have suddenly, or maybe not suddenly, maybe it was over time, a much larger African-American middle class, upper class, and that's due to, of course, Fort Monroe, because the military is integrating a little bit more. NASA, whenever it became NASA, NACA, and of course Hampton University. So you're looking at a Hampton that is very, very different than it had been.
Well, and Hampton has always had a very vibrant African American community.
Yes.
Even
Since
before
the
slavery.
contraband,
Even
legacy.
before slavery ended, Hampton had a very large free black population, and the enslaved Hamptonians were treated a little differently than plantation slaves would have been treated. They were mostly craftsmen. So they might have been hired out to a job, so they weren't kind of tied to the land. Then, of course, after the war, the contrabands were here, and they built this wonderfully vibrant middle-class business community in Hampton. And now here we have coming to Hampton this engineering
Highly
group,
educated,
this educated scientific civil servants who, again, keeps this community vibrant and diversified. Especially, academically, which was a big change as well. You had Hampton University, but Hampton's population were, again, businessmen and working people, and suddenly we have this academic class, which, posed a little bit of a culture clash to begin with, but very quickly they began to be integrated into Hampton's society, and they began to marry each other, and families were built off of the newcomers from Michigan and Massachusetts, and now they're us.
So you're going to tell this story as part of the 20th Century Gallery at the museum. When does this expansion open?
It opens on March 17th. We'll be having our members-only preview on the evening of the 16th, and then we will be open to the public on March 17th in the morning.
I think that is such an important thing, to look at this story and to continue to tell it, because Hampton is a constantly changing place, and none of us alive remember those early days and what an impact it had. And so keeping our history going and understanding and changing the idea of our history, because sometimes the people who did the storytelling got the bulk of it.
True.
And not everyone had quite the platform. So going back and doing some of that research and retelling.
Oh, it's been so much fun. That's been the hard part, is when to stop researching, because there's so much there to dig into. But it is, Hampton's culture, Hampton's economy just changed. It just changed. And this was the driving force behind it. And it's so much a part of us now that maybe we lose track of that.
Right. And then you're obviously going to tell the space race part,
Absolutely.
which we don't have time to do as much in detail today.
Well, we won't go into detail.
We'll save something for people who are going to come see the
But we have
exhibit.
a lot of bridges in Hampton named after astronauts for a reason.
I get a request from someone in the media about every 2 years. Where are the bridges? Are they,
And we're telling that story.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you so much, because people do forget they lived here. We didn't just randomly name them.
And they're still here.
And there's a reason Mercury Boulevard is no longer Military Highway.
Is correct.
I mean, that is a big part of Spacetown, as we were once
Spacetown,
called.
USA.
Well, thank you so much, Alan.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for watching, and I know we could not tell the entire history here, so I hope you will get to the museum and see this part and help us spread the word and remember and appreciate Hampton's history and NASA's role in that history. Thanks for watching.